Is the EU disintegrating? And short of a member state leaving, which is what we have witnessed now with Brexit, what does this integration look like?
Yeah, okay. The EU is always disintegrating on some level, right? Integration is not some monolithic process that drags everybody with it. And if you were to go inside the countries of the EU, you would find differences are getting wider and wider between groups of people. And if you look across the countries, you find differences are getting wider and wider. And that's what it looks like, right? I mean, disintegration is where people are losing out and nobody is helping them along the way. And they're losing out in part because of the project, but in part because of the dynamics that the project unleashes.
So has we will talk about the Eurozone crisis in a minute. But I want to start with the most recent challenge that makes other challenges perhaps look more manageable, or we just don't talk about them more, like even the refugee crisis, for example, or Brexit that I just mentioned, but they don't go away because of COVID-19. COVID-19 overshadows all other problems. But I would put to you that COVID-19 makes other problems also worse, including the Eurozone crisis. So has the EU handled the pandemic response well?
I think the initial EU response to the pandemic was pretty bad, to be honest. It showed all the signs of a lack of coordination. And it took a while for the EU even to get around to the idea that they have to trade freely medical supplies across European countries. Remember, that was that horrible moment where it looked as though Germany was going to withhold access to respirators. And now they figured that out, but now they're going on the other side, right? So if you were to look at the latest Franco-German agreement, point number one of that agreement is the need for European sovereignty, whatever that means, in the health sector. And so then you begin to get the sense that maybe Europe is trying to overcompensate by creating its own sort of autonomous health sector community. I'm not saying that's necessarily a bad thing, but it does show the extent to which the Europeans still haven't figured out what they really want, right? They haven't made the pendulum stop swinging in this regard. And I think you're absolutely right. It's affecting all other problems that the Europeans have, right? Because they've got to get this health crisis sorted. And that includes opening up the borders, right? And I guess this is the last point I would make, right? You know, the thing that Europe has succeeded in doing that is truly remarkable is making it easy for goods and services to flow from one country to the next, but also for people to move from one country to the next. And now there's a real sense that the Europeans don't trust one another in health terms. So they don't want people to move from one country to the next. And the European Union doesn't really have an adequate response to that. So that's a worrying problem.
Isn't that though one of the failures of the EU early on in the outbreak, right? That it is obvious that the virus spreads through people traveling, right? And the commitment that the EU has maintained towards the freedom of movement facilitated then the spread of the virus. I mean, we had a situation where Lombardy was locked down and then the whole of Italy was locked down, but people were still free to travel out of Milan to Ireland and Germany and where have you.
Well, I think that has a lot to do with the lack of understanding of the nature of a pandemic. And I know that as societies, we've gone through pandemics, you know, repeatedly since society was created, right? But each generation has the same learning process that they have to go through when they confront this type of situation. And unlike the people of Asia, the SARS pandemic didn't really have a huge impact in Europe. Even H1N1 didn't have a huge impact in Europe. So there wasn't an instinctive response to recognize the local nature of the problem. And it had to be learned from one country to the next. Some countries learned it really quickly. So for example, the Austrians looked at the Italian situation and said, okay, we realize what we have to do now. And I think the Czechs and the Slovaks both separately and collectively recognize it as well. But if you look at the British didn't understand it at all. They were running flights until the very last minute. And I think this is a little bit of a problem that we're going to have to inculcate norms around. But I wouldn't hold Europe responsible. I mean, look at what's going on in the United States, right? I mean, it's a learning process everywhere.
Going back to Italy, and you are based at the Bologna campus of Johns Hopkins University, so you see it kind of firsthand. You are in Bologna. I mean, it strikes me that, and you mentioned Southeast Asia, but it strikes me that when you compare the situation in Europe with what happened in China, and one of my colleagues is from Wuhan, Jenny, who helped to design this course. In China, Wuhan was locked down, right? And basically people are locked in. But then you had, once it was accepted that this is a national emergency, you had resources channeled into that region. And that is something that didn't quite happen in Italy, right? At least not early on. And that is why Italians became somewhat disillusioned with Europe. Can you give us a sense of the perception, public perception of Europe, of the European Union in Italy now?
Okay, yeah, I just want to correct one thing, because the way you said it was a little bit confusing. It did happen in Italy, that when Lombardy went into its initial lockdown, when we locked down the hot zones in northern Italy, resources from across the country flooded into that region. They did a call for medical personnel, for example, and it was oversubscribed by a factor of 10, right? So in that sense, you got the kind of solidarity that you would expect within Italy. But your point was about Europe, right?
That is, now I want to interject here, because we talked about also with Hans Kudnani and a number of other guests, that was the moment of nation states, right? And so we can see that it is possible to mobilize the sense of solidarity within nation states. This is what I would expect to happen. But if Europe is serious about a Europe that protects, it ought to have happened also at the European level, right?
But again, first, with benefit of hindsight, of course I agree with you, right? And I think most Europeans would agree with you with benefit of hindsight. But the problem is that, this pandemic was such a strange learning process that when it came to a neighboring country, it never had that sense of immediacy. And I don't think anybody in Europe has ever been deluded into believing that Austrians and Italians think they're all one people, right? And so in that sense, when it came to Italy, the Austrians looked at it as an Italian problem without ever thinking of it as a European problem. And I think the same would be true of Germany as well. As a consequence of which they didn't react in the way that you would expect. They did react subsequently in the way that you would expect. But the immediate reaction was, it's somebody else's problem. And it's never going to come to us because these things don't happen here. And the learning process was, the disease doesn't really know the difference between Italians and Austrians, and it will happen everywhere that the disease arrives, right? And I think now that Europe recognizes that, the pendulum has swung in the opposite direction, just as I've said. And yet there's still a sense, I believe, that some countries think they responded better and are therefore more immune to this problem, even if they're not more immune to the disease. And when we see the second wave in the autumn, if there is a second wave, and most epidemiologists suggest there will be, it's very likely that those countries that are most self-confident in their response to the initial wave will be most hard hit. And that's an unfortunate reality.
So you are not spelling it out, but you are probably talking about Germany as opposed to Italy, right? Because the perception is in Europe, I mean, from an Asian or Southeast Asian perspective, it's kind of weird because Germany also has an incredible number of fatalities, but in European context, right, Germany seems to have handled it well. And you already mentioned the Franco-German proposal. Will that proposal be enough? Will it be enough to help economies on Europe's periphery to recover? And also, importantly for the European project, will it be enough to restore the credibility of the entire project in the eyes of the Italian electorate that is so disillusioned with Europe?
Okay, so the short answer to that question is no, right? I mean, even if the Franco-German proposal was embraced as it was presented as a whole, the only people who are ever going to get excited about it are people who study European integration and understand the mechanics of fiscal federalism. The average person on the street is never going to get excited about that proposal because it's not an exciting proposal. It has some money, about 500 billion euros that they promised over a 3-year period. 500 billion euros in a 14 trillion euro economy over a 3-year period. We're talking about 1% of GDP, right? So in that sense, it's not shock and awe, and it's certainly not some magical political foundational moment, but it could be something useful institutionally that students of European integration could latch onto and say, well, if we follow this trajectory of development, Europe could be very different in the future. But in political terms, the traction that this agreement gets is very little, right? And I think we should be well aware of that. The market reaction, though, was stronger than the popular political reaction. And the market reaction was to take some of the strain out of the sovereign debt markets, and that was also a good thing. We'll see today, by the way, what the proposal really looks like, and then when we have the European Council Summit in June, we'll see what's actually on the table.
So quite a few people refer to it as a Hamiltonian moment, including the German finance minister. You have a different view of that, right? Do you want to tell?
Yeah, well, I mean, come on. Hamiltonian moment sounds super dramatic. My concern is that what we saw immediately in response to that proposal was a deep division between countries in the north and countries in the south. And that division needs to relax. Now, already the division has relaxed a little bit. The Germans have expressed their determination. The Austrians and the Danes have relaxed their position and said that they will look for some kind of a compromise. But we'll have to wait and see what the Dutch and the Swedes say. And there's the whole part of Central and Eastern Europe that's yet to speak on this proposal, right? I mean, and their attitudes may be very different altogether. And here I would just come back to one point that we made earlier. It's not just Germany that thinks it did well in the first phase of this crisis. It's also Scandinavia outside of Sweden. They think they did well. And it's Central and Eastern Europe, particularly the more fragile parts of Central and Eastern Europe. They think they did well. And they're confident that they'll be able to do the same trick the next time around. And unfortunately, that's only going to work if there's a canary in the coal mine that's going to pass out and signal to them that they need to lock down again. If unfortunately they turn out to be the canary, then they're dead, right? So we have to be very attentive to those potential.
Well, the people in Central and Eastern Europe would worry about this principle of transnational solidarity misapplied, right? This is the kind of discussion that we've been having over the last decade, that a country like Slovakia that has been fiscally responsible, right, that didn't spend too much of its income generated through taxation, would then need to support countries that are still pro capita much more affluent, like Italy, right? So how do you see that unfolding?
So this is part of the reason why the Franco-German proposal is to run this 500 billion through the multi-annual financial framework, which is the European Union's budget, and to use it to fill the expenditure categories that already exist, which favor the countries of Central and Eastern Europe, because it's necessary also to get resources to those countries. So I think, I understand the concern of those countries, but the structure of the spending is meant to benefit them. And they're not net contributors yet, right? At some point they may be. I think the deeper point that you make is that, countries like Slovakia not only came into the European Union on less than equitable terms in the enlargement process, but they also came in the middle of a massive macroeconomic adjustment, right? If you go to Bratislava, that's one thing. If you go to Eastern Slovakia, the level of unemployment and industrial wastage is extraordinary and still remains to be addressed. So I can understand why politically it's very difficult for them to say, look, we've been going through this adjustment process for 30 years, and then to look at the countries of Southern Europe and say, but let's help you go through an adjustment process that you've only just started, right? So I think they have a real legitimate reason to look at this differently.
I want to move our discussion now to something that is very current and that is bound to change in ways that we can't anticipate. But there was a major decision taken by the German Constitutional Court, Bundesverfassungsgericht, that declared or questioned the legitimacy of the ECB actions, right? The purchasing, buying program, the program that enables ECB to buy government bonds. That also in turn challenges actually the decision of the European Court of Justice, right? Has the ECB operated within its mandate?
So this is an interesting thing, right? The only people who are authorized to ascertain whether the ECB has operated within its mandate are in the European Court of Justice, and they say it has. So the ECB is actually the only institution that's not in trouble with this German Constitutional Court ruling. The institution that's in trouble is the German government and the German Bundestag. And that's because the German Constitutional Court says that the German government and the German Bundestag has not supervised the ECB adequately. So whether or not the ECB has behaved appropriately, the supervision provided by the German government and the Bundestag has not been adequate. And yet how we get more adequate supervision without violating the principle of central bank independence remains to be seen. So I think this is a very interesting constitutional dilemma that the court raises that creates tensions not just between Germany and Europe, but between the German Constitutional Court and the German government, much more importantly.
And the irony, of course, is that it was Germany that insisted on the idea that the central bank must be independent, because that was the positive experience with their own German Bundesbank that was always independent. But you evaded the question a bit. I ask you, what do you think about the ECB, whether it acted within its mandate?
I mean, so, you know, as a political economist, I would say, you know, the ECB did act within its mandate because it's doing exactly what it was told to do, which is to preserve price stability, using whatever means necessary, and to only worry about other things once the goal of price stability is achieved. And everything that it's doing can be traced back to the preservation of price stability, right? So I think in that sense, it's achieved its mandate. On the other hand, I'm very understanding of the German Constitutional Court when it says that when the ECB buys bonds, government bonds, and holds them to maturity, and then receives the money when those bonds mature and buys identical bonds from the same government and holds them to maturity, that looks an awful lot like the ECB is financing a government. Right? I mean, how could it look like anything else? And so in that context, I can understand that the German Constitutional Court would say, well, this looks like monetary financing, which is not allowed in the treaty. Now, it's not for the German Constitutional Court to decide that, but I'm very sympathetic to their perspective. I would agree. I think that fiscal authorities have not done their job in Europe, and they've forced monetary authorities, the European Central Bank and all the national central banks, to do much more to respond to the last crisis than they should have had to do. And as a consequence, to do much more to respond to this crisis than they're even capable of doing, right? I mean, they can obviously do anything, but it's pretty extraordinary the limits that they have to go to generate enough monetary stimulus just to keep Europe's economy afloat.
The last question is the one that we have argued over for the last 10 years. And that is simply, was the euro a mistake? And what caused the Eurozone crisis? I mean, you know that I think that it was a mistake because it was meant to bring the nations of Europe closer together. It resulted in more hostilities between the nations of Europe. Italians are distrustful of Germans, etc. And it was also meant to have made Germany more European, while it ended up creating a Europe that is German. And we were just reminded of it by the German Constitutional Court making a decision that of the entire project.
So it's funny, the way you draw the notion of mistake back to original intent, right? And so I'm gonna say we actually agree, right? If your goal in creating the euro was to have the single currency bring people together politically, then you made a mistake, right? Because that's not what money does. You know, nobody ever should fight about money because that divides people. It doesn't unite them. But there were many people who had different goals, right? And when I wrote originally about the politics of monetary union, I identified at least 5 different groups of goals, right? And one of the groups of goals was to eliminate forever and anon exchange rate volatility within Europe in order to foster the completion of the internal market. And in that context, the euro was not a mistake. It was to further financial market integration. And in that context, it was not a mistake. There were mistakes that were made that were separate from the euro, but the euro itself was not a mistake. It was to create a zone of monetary stability to insulate from outside forces like the United States. And it succeeded in that beyond anybody's wildest dreams. So it was not a mistake. So in economic technical terms, the euro actually turns out to have been much more successful than anyone would have thought. But I would agree with you, in political terms, it has failed to do what those people who looked at money as a political resource imagined it might do. And my only question was, whatever made them think that in the first place? Because I can't think of anywhere in the world that money has achieved the kind of goal that they believe it would achieve in the European case.
Professor Erik Jones, thank you. Thank you very much for all your insight. Thank you.